We're going to call the meeting to order here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. And welcome to the August 20th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. Could I have a roll call, please?
Chair Beck,
Here.
Commissioner Lavra. Here. Commissioner Tisdale,
Here.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Here.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Here.
Commissioner McGinn. Here. Commissioner Lark,
Here.
Commissioner Finch.
Here.
Okay, has everyone had an opportunity to read the minutes? Does anybody have any changes they'd like to make to the minutes? Would anyone like to move to approve the minutes?
So moved. Second.
Commissioner Lark,
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn,
Abstain.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Abstain.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdale.
Yes.
Commissioner Lavra,
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. Okay, so we're just going to go down the line, starting with Commissioner Finch. Do you have any reports you'd like to make? No report. Commissioner Lark?
I just want to point out that I attended the farmers market in downtown Everett. It was fantastic activation of urban space, so good policies.
Was that the first one in the downtown area?
The first one that I've been to, so, but I think it's the second one overall, so it was excellent, excellent location.
Commissioner McGinn, do you have a report?
None for me. No report? None.
No report.
Okay, and I have no report. All right, so we'll move along to staff.
Alan Giffen, Planning Director. We will be having a Planning Commission meeting on September 3rd. We will have our consultant for the Climate Action Plan here that night to present some information and take public comments. And we will also be talking about one other item, which, if I can find my agenda, oh yeah, Vision 2050, the PSRC's update to Vision 2040. I'll be giving you some background information, and it's no action on our part, but kind of leads to some future work items for the Planning Commission. That's it.
Okay, so at this time, if there's anybody in the audience that would like to speak to something that is not on the agenda, I know that we have quite a few comments that want to be made for Agenda 2, but this is for anything that is not on the agenda. Okay, so seeing no comments, we're actually going to move agenda item number 2 up to agenda item number 1 because so many people have come to actually speak on this.
Okay, good evening. Once again, Alan Giffen, Planning Director. And tonight's public workshop is concerning supportive housing within single-family zones. The City Council adopted an ordinance in June that put a moratorium on, put a moratorium in place on the establishment of supportive housing in single-family zones. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so the moratorium the ordinance that council adopted in June established a moratorium on applications for supportive housing within single-family zones. Under our current code, supportive housing is allowed in single-family zones, but only on publicly owned properties. It would not be allowed, for example, on a single-family lot in the middle of a subdivided neighborhood, but on land that's owned by public agencies such as city, school district, PUD, state, county, public agency, it is permitted. But then the council adopted this moratoriums to review the current regulations. And so tonight I will provide some background information about the zoning regulations, the list of items that the City Council has asked the Planning Commission to review. We'll encourage public feedback tonight, and then I will ask Planning Commission to give staff any direction that you have for preparation of some alternatives for our next public workshop. So the current code was amended in 2016. It was based upon the Housing First model to address some of the homeless issues that we were facing in the city and still are. The Housing First model is intended to get people off of the streets and into housing in order to stabilize their lives and help them transition to a more successful living arrangement. In order to do that, our code was at that time allowed supportive housing just under the heading or the land use category of multifamily housing, which was permitted in multifamily zones and in most commercial zones. The code amendment established supportive housing as a separate land use category in the zoning code, and it also established supportive housing as a permitted use in multifamily and commercial zones, as it had been under the previous regulatory scheme, but allowed in single-family zones on publicly owned properties. It also established a new parking standard, off-street parking standard for supportive housing, which previously, again, as multifamily housing was just regulated in terms of the amount of off-street parking required is required for multifamily housing. The City Council asked Planning Commission to consider a number of factors in reviewing whether or not to amend the code. And I'm not going to read each of these to you. You've got a very detailed staff memo that provides some commentary about each of those things, and I'll cover those more in a little bit in just a moment here. But the one point off of this page is the second bullet point that council discussed, because staff did ask, does council want to just eliminate single-family zones as being eligible for supportive housing? And the commission, or excuse me, the council did not reject that out, or did not respond in a way that led staff to believe that they wanted to just eliminate that as a possible use in the single-family zones based on some of their conversation. I'll cover that a little bit more in a moment. Some of the other things that they asked about were provision of sidewalks, proximity to transit, building height and density, proximity to social services. The project review process, should that be hearing examiner as it is currently, or one of the council members suggested that maybe the city council should be the land use review authority on supportive housing, and also the definition of supportive housing. Some other things the council asked for were just comments or thoughts about open space, green space, on-site, our ability to enforce conditions of approval that are applied through the hearing examiner process, and how do we review impacts to the neighborhoods. So since the code amendment in 2016 establishing supportive housing as a separate land use, we've had 3 applications approved and under construction, and a 4th one that is currently undergoing the review process. Claire's Place, which is the property on Berkshire Road on what had formerly been city-owned property, is just now getting occupied. It was recently finished. It's in an R1 zone. The HopeWorks Broadway project is in an urban mixed zone on Broadway. It's supportive housing for 65 units, I believe. Cocoon House on Colby, which is partially located in the multifamily zone, partially in a B1 neighborhood business zone, is open. And then the proposed Compass Health is undergoing, building is undergoing review currently in the land use process. It's on Lombard, located in the urban mix zone. One of the things that the the City Council asked Planning Commission to review is the type of management models that would be required or proposed for supportive housing. And the code does not distinguish what type of management plan is required based upon the type of tenant or the income levels, disabilities, anything of that nature for supportive housing. It's just a requirement for a management plan. And so it is something that is tailored based upon the specific needs of the population being served and the needs or impacts that might be generated by that specific project. The code requires a management plan for any type of a supportive housing project, and part of that includes outreach to neighbors, both before the use is established and after it is up and operational. Outreach plans and communications protocol between neighbors and the supportive housing operator. The code currently requires that the management plan identify and discuss the nature of the supportive housing project and its intended occupants, identify the impacts or potential impacts on nearby uses and how those would be mitigated, specify what methods of neighborhood outreach and communication will be used between the housing operator and the neighborhood, and identifying the management contact persons responsible to resolve the concerns that may arise concerning the supportive housing facility, and to provide a description of staffing, supervision, and security arrangements that will be in place. It also, the code requires a 24-hour per day on-site management on the site. On-site services for residents would be permitted for the residents of the facility only, and a requirement to update contact information whenever, with the neighborhood in the city whenever changes occur. And then any other information that may be determined through the review process. So for example, if the hearing examiner wanted additional information, or in the case of those types, and this applies to supportive housing of any type in any zone, not just in single-family zones. In some cases, the supportive housing in commercial zones or multifamily zones is not reviewed by the hearing examiner. It's reviewed by an administrative process, and if the city staff wanted additional information that wasn't provided in the management plan, then that could be a requirement before any approval was issued. One of the things that the council asked was, should we allow supportive housing in single-family zones, but with standards that are applicable in those zones for single-family uses? And in the current code, the height and density is determined through the public review process. So on publicly owned properties, it's not unusual for those to be bigger than a standard subdivision lot in a single-family neighborhood. And so, for example, city utility property was the first example with the Berkshire property, Berkshire housing project, Claire's Place. A very large piece of property, but zoned R1. School district properties, PUD sites, a number of different types of publicly owned lands are typically larger than a standard subdivision lot, and so the code provided for some flexibility in determining how tall a building could be or how many dwelling units or supportive housing rooms could be provided within the facility through that public review process, instead of stating any density standard or maximum height standard. Part of the criteria include reviewing for compatibility with surrounding uses. That's part of the evaluation criteria that I'll cover in a little bit more detail in a moment. The city can require design changes to a proposal in order to promote greater compatibility. So for example, things such as reducing building height in closer proximity to single-family homes, or changing the location of buildings, requiring additional landscape buffering or things of that nature to improve the compatibility between a proposed building and surrounding land uses. In single-family zones, at least for single-family development, the maximum height allowed is 28 feet. The range of density that is allowed in the 5 single-family zones that we have in the city ranges from about 4 units per acre on the low end up to 15 units per acre in the R2A zone. And so if there were a density standard applied, then it would be somewhere within that range, depending upon the zone in which a property was located. But currently, again, density or the a number of units or rooms that's allowed in supportive housing is determined through the current review process within single-family zones. In the RS and the R1 zone, only single-family detached housing is permitted. In the R2 zone, single-family detached and duplex housing is permitted. And in the R1A and R2A zone, townhouses are permitted. And so in the R1A zone, it's up to 12 units per acre. In the R2 zone, it's up to 15 units per acre. Public notice is another one of the things that City Council asked about. They suggested or asked about the possibility of requiring public notice earlier in the process. And it's interesting that they asked for that because the instance that brought it to the City Council's attention was something that has never been an application. Yet they were asking for notice that might be required or provided sooner in the process. And under our current code, we do not require any prior public notice for any type of land use except one that I'll touch on in a moment. But typically we do encourage an applicant before they file an application to meet with neighbors, discuss the project, identify the issues and concerns that neighbors may have so that they can incorporate those concerns into the design of their project. The only process in our code that requires contact prior to an application, but actually required in the code, is in the institutional overlay zone, which is typically something of a large institutional use, such as the college or the hospital, something that takes up a lot more land than most types of land uses within our code. And in that particular process, there's a requirement for a public meeting before a major institution would make application for an institutional overlay zone. On all other land uses, public notice is provided after an application is filed. And typically that's at the point where the city staff have determined that we have a complete application that has enough information for the city to be able to process and issue a land use decision. Until we have a complete application, no notice is provided because we won't be processing it unless we do have a complete application. One of the things that the council asked the Planning Commission to consider is the parking standard for supportive housing. Prior to 2016, when the supportive housing amendment was made, we regulated supportive housing just as multifamily housing. If there were supportive services provided, that was considered just as an accessory use to the multifamily use of the property. And so the parking standard that applied was really just the standard for multifamily use, which in most, it varies from town, different parts of the city, different zones, and based upon the size of housing units within a multifamily development, anywhere from one to more typically 1.5 to 2 spaces per dwelling unit under the previous code. In the 2016 code amendment, the establishing supportive housing as a separate land use, separate category of land use, the standard was amended, or not amended, but established to provide 1 off-street parking spaces per 4 rooms of supportive housing. In a subsequent amendment in just last year when we were updating parking standards citywide, the and I've got the standard incorrectly stated here. It was 1 space per 4 rooms plus 1 parking space for each 2 staff persons on duty at a maximum shift. So it's not quite as it reads here, but it is stated correctly in your staff packet. So but again, it's a much lower parking standard than the standard for multifamily housing. City Council asked for consideration of sidewalks and pedestrian safety for supportive housing. And the code currently addresses that through the evaluation criteria during the public review process. And I'll get to some more criteria in just a moment that talk about all of those different criteria. But if pedestrian facilities are not adequate, then the applicant would either have to build additional pedestrian facilities, sidewalks, connections to the existing network, or if it was too far removed from a pedestrian network, the application would likely be denied. In the example of Claire's Place, which was approved under the current regulation, the applicant was required to build a sidewalk on Berkshire that connected that site to transit and services that are located on Evergreen Way. So that's one example of how that code has been used. One of the other criteria that council asked for review was the access and proximity to public transit. And the current code, the 2016 code, does require a site for transit, or excuse me, supportive housing to be located within 500 feet of public transit. And the intent is so residents who typically do not drive or have cars have access to transit so they can get to wherever they may need to travel. And if a site does not have reasonable access to transit, then it would not be eligible for supportive housing. This code uses 500 feet as a standard. For most populations, and code standard is typically a quarter mile is considered a reasonable walking distance to transit. This is a much shorter distance, obviously, than a quarter mile, which is 1,320 feet. And we measured that in terms of the actual walking distance between the supportive housing property and the transit stop. So it's not as the crow flies. As for building height and density, that was also separate items that the council asked to review, and we've addressed that in a little bit more detail in the staff packet, but also on the slides where they asked about allowing in single-family zones, but with standards that are applicable for single-family uses. So in the case of a single-family zone, 28 feet building height and the allowable density that might exist in any of those single-family zones. Council asked about should there be any standard for proximity to social services, and by definition, supportive housing does have on-site services. Perhaps not every service that a resident may need, but those that are most critical for them to residents to have a functional living arrangement in the supportive housing project. But if we were to establish criteria that required proximity to social services within the community, chances are it would result in most supportive housing being encouraged in the north end of the city and near downtown where more social services exist. And South Everett would probably then not qualify for supportive housing if proximity is a code requirement. Now, one of the reasons that we have the standard for access to transit is to enable residents to be able to access their needed services, whatever those may be, rather than having all the services provided on site or in close proximity. As for the review process, one council member asked if maybe the city council should be the review authority. And I'm going to assume that he meant that would only be for review in single-family zones, for supportive housing proposed in single-family zones, since that was the action or the part of the code for which the moratorium was established. The planning director review process is used in multifamily and commercial zones. That does involve public notification, but not a public hearing. And the city council actually established the hearing examiner process back in 1980 in the city because they found themselves in the process of reviewing lots of rezones and subdivisions and conditional uses and shoreline permits and things that they really did not enjoy and that they did not really have the expertise to review under the law in many cases. And so they found that that system was preferable and has been in place since 1980. There's one exception to that, and that is for the siting of aircraft takeoff and landing facilities in our code. That is something that does require review by the city council because that has much broader more policy level impacts on a community than a standard land use application. We've only had one of those that I'm aware of proposed in the time that I've worked for the city. Was for a helicopter landing facility at a business out in Southwest Everett, and the Planning Commission reviewed it, made a recommendation to the City Council to deny it, and the application was withdrawn, so the council didn't even get to take action on that one. So that's the only type of land use short of a standard land use application. This a little bit different than a comprehensive plan amendment or rezone type of action that City Council does have authority over, but for specific land uses, that's the only one. I provided in your packet some background materials about the hearing examiner system in the state of Washington, several different articles that give you a little bit more information about that. So, whether or not that's something you want to recommend to the City Council, we can talk about further. And the council asked if, in response to a question from staff, if they want us to review the definition of supportive housing. And one of the reasons for that is that the definition does use the term that the housing type is a multifamily dwelling. And so if the Council Planning Commission wanted to modify the standards for single-family zones so that it was a different type of form of housing, then that particular clause within the definition would have to be modified. The definition also does talk about that housing is designed for occupancy by persons that are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness, or experiencing a disability that presents barriers to employment and housing stability, or generally require structured supportive services such as case management and 24-hour on-site facility management. And the definition also says that it's intended to provide long-term rather than transitional housing. So those are some things that we can review, and staff will likely make some recommendations for modifying this definition later during the process, just some things that we feel ought to be reevaluated. Open space and green space, there were two kind of different topics lumped together here. One is that the testimony at the hearing on the moratorium, people were talking about the loss of community open space that exists on undeveloped properties. And so in the case of public properties, such as the one that triggered the City Council's review, it's an open field on a school district-owned property. And so there is a concern about just a loss of open space in the community when development occurs, no matter what type of land use. And then there was also questions, comments from the the council about on-site open space. And we do require under our code for most types of multifamily housing a certain amount of on-site open space. Depending upon the nature of the residents of a supportive housing facility who may or may not be able to utilize outdoor open space, there may be more value to some other type of open space or common area arrangements on the site. So those things are reviewed on a case-by-case basis under the current code. One council member suggested that a green roof is one potential type of on-site open space. There is also comments or questions about the conditions of approval that may be placed on a supportive housing development by the hearing examiner enforceable. And yes, the short answer is yes. All of our codes are enforceable. Under Chapter 120 of the Municipal Code, we have an enforcement system in place that we can enforce any of our land use regulations through that process. Impacts to the neighborhood. The code addresses those in two different sets of sections of the municipal code. There's under the supportive housing requirements, under Chapter 39 of the zoning code, there's and those criteria are listed in the staff memorandum to the Planning Commission. And then also in Chapter 41 of the zoning code, under the evaluation criteria that the hearing examiner uses to determine compatibility of any special property use that is undergoing a hearing examiner review. And so those criteria include things such as the adequacy of streets, utilities, and public services, traffic impacts, pedestrian circulation, public safety, and the ability of the proponent to mitigate any impacts that are identified, site access, on-site parking, circulation, compatibility of proposed buildings with surrounding properties, landscaping, buffering, screening. Would a project development generate nuisance impacts, things like noise or vibration, dust or odor? And is there access to transit? Those are all requirements in the existing code that apply to anything that is being reviewed by the hearing examiner as a special property use. So for the workshop tonight, I would encourage questions from the commission. Looks like we've got a lot of public comments people are here to make tonight. We'd like some feedback from the commission to staff so that for the September 17th workshop, we can provide additional options for you to consider or additional information. And then, so that will be the next meeting, September 17th, 4 weeks from tonight. And then a planning commission public hearing would be 4 weeks after that on October 15th, potentially a decision for you to make a recommendation to the city council. So for that, for now, I'll turn it back to you for any questions that you may have.
Does anyone have questions of staff? Commissioner Zelinski? Or Yanisak, whichever one.
Sorry, I think we all have questions, it sounds like. So my first question, going down, I guess I have a couple questions. What we're talking about tonight is the code change that authorized supportive housing only in single-family residential zones.
That's what the city council has asked the planning commission to review.
And the exception applies to lands owned by public agencies. That would, in my mind, I'm thinking state, county, city, PUD, port, school district. Is that about it? Practically
That covers
speaking?
probably most situations in the city that are publicly owned lands.
And is there a requirement that that government owner has to maintain ownership of the land to put this supportive housing on it? Or how is that working? Who would actually be building and constructing and running this?
There is a section in the code that I'll have to look up here, but let's see.
Or are they generally transferring ownership to
Yes,
somebody?
it would be transferring ownership and responsibility for operation to typically a nonprofit housing provider. So that at some point I'll find this in the code here and be able to point that out to you. Yeah, basically it has to be publicly owned property. It can remain publicly owned property, or the code does provide for transferring ownership to a nonprofit housing provider to provide and manage this.
Does it have to be a nonprofit, or could it be just to a private corporation that wants to operate a supportive housing? I guess that's ultimately what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Does it have to maintain public, or the public agency? It only has to be public at the outset and then be transferred to a non-public?
Correct. And let's see, here we are. So I'll read this to you, and it's actually in the definition. So let's see, the housing type is a multifamily dwelling owned or sponsored by a qualified nonprofit provider or government entity designed for occupancy by persons that are either experiencing, that definition I read you earlier. It's actually a separate part of the code. So in our use table, where table 5-1, where it lists supportive housing as a review process 3 in the single family zones, there are 5 of those that I mentioned. There's a special regulation, number 27, that says permitted only on land owned by a public agency or that the public agency has transferred to another entity for the purpose of developing supportive housing. So it's not limited to nonprofit, but that's typically what we would anticipate.
And I guess there's a requirement then that they maintain that, because could they build supportive housing, then at some point, they figure they don't want to operate it anymore, and they decide they want to transfer it to a property management company who
And then
wants
it
to do
has
something
to
else?
comply with the code, which means that in the single-family zone, it wouldn't be permitted if it were developed as multifamily housing. And so there's typically a long-term requirement for maintaining that or transferring it to somebody else to maintain that supportive housing.
And then I guess I have two other questions, and I don't want to hog all the time here. Because we're talking about a relatively limited number of potential owners who could transfer this property, and in addition, they have to be parcels in single-family zones within 500 feet of transit, I imagine we're talking about, across the city, a relatively small number of parcels that would even fall into this category.
That's, I'm sure you're right. We haven't done the
That's what I was going to ask.
mapping exercise, and we can do that before the next.
Do we know how many actual pieces we're even talking about, or is it?
Yeah,
that would
we
even
we
be
don't know,
eligible?
but we can get that information. We do have a pretty good transit network throughout the city that you can probably find a number of other publicly owned properties within 500 feet, but, we'll get the numbers for you.
And I guess ultimately what I would wonder about that would be, since part of the effort of allowing this was to address the need and the lack of housing and the need in the housing first model, but if we're only talking 2 or 3 potential parcels across the whole city, it would seem to me the impact of that would be relatively small, and that would help frame the conversation at least moving forward. And then one other question I had is, when you mentioned in the presentation there have been 4 applications since, but is it true that even without the exception for, or the change in the code in 2016 to allow it in single-family zones, that 3 of those would have been allowable previously anyway?
That's correct.
So the only one that so far has taken advantage of that, I guess, would be the Claire's Place.
With the notable comment that they all benefited from the reduced parking standard.
Got it. Thank you.
Commissioner Zelinski?
My question also has to do with the definition. The last part of the definition that talks about providing long-term rather than transitional housing. To my way of thinking, that would seem to eliminate certain kinds of populations, such as people going through detox or transitioning out of detox, or like battered spouses, that kind of thing, where it's transitional. Is that correct? Am I right with that?
That is correct. It's intended that,
So these
and
would
that's
be,
one of the things that we'll be looking at would be the definition. It is intended under the current definition, exactly as you say, that it's not transitional.
so people, the populations would be more people with long-term disabilities or non-reversible situations.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just curious about the hearing examiner. What components does the hearing examiner cover, and is the management plan reviewed at all in the hearing examiner's decision?
The management plan is reviewed as part of the consideration of all of the information that's provided. The management plan is a requirement for the application process. The hearing examiner does review all of the information if there are issues or concerns that are brought up from staff, from the public, from public safety agencies, anybody who really has a concern or comment. The hearing examiner has the authority to, require additional information or, perhaps even condition a project or deny a project if it's found that impact from an inadequate management plan just doesn't give them confidence that it'll meet all the criteria for land use compatibility.
I have a question if nobody else does.
Commissioner Lara?
Yes, so I have a question about the requirement for 24-hour on-site manager for every type of tenant. And I'm just wondering, it seems a little bit extreme, and it would depend on the type of tenant, I would think. And so my question is, you say here staff does not think the code should differentiate requirements between different supportive housing tenants, and you believe that the current code has sufficient detail and flexibility to address the management needs and necessary staffing support for any specific type. So those seem a little contradictory. Would it be possible to not require 24-hour management, on-site management, or is that an absolute requirement for every type?
It is a requirement under the current code, so that's something that you could consider changing if you felt it was,
Maybe a
appropriate.
little more flexibility might, at some point in the review process, I would think, might be possible.
Okay, thank you.
I guess my question is, on the original, did they just, why no notification prior to purchasing the land? Why is this use special that you go buy the land and then you go through the notification process and the planning process? And because the developer's potentially hanging a bunch of time, effort, and money out there that could backfire on them. And also, if I want to put a fence up, I've got to notify people in my neighborhood. I just wonder what the thinking or the rationale was about that.
Well, under our current code, there is nothing that requires anybody to notify anybody when they acquire property. If school district is selling property or acquiring property, or a public agency is having discussions about potential uses of their property, it's not a city-involved process. There's nothing in our code that can require that. If there is an interest, as the city council asked, of requiring an applicant to contact the neighborhood before they actually make application to the city, that's something else. I think your question was more about acquisition of property.
Yes, but I can't go in and acquire into a residential zone and acquire property with the understanding I'm going to use it for a gas station, as an example.
No, and if that situation did exist, you would have to make application for a comprehensive plan amendment and rezone, which involves public notification. After application is made, there's nothing in our code that requires you to notify neighbors prior to making application, but as I mentioned, we always encourage that contact before application is made.
Just a quick question. You mentioned you encourage contact prior to the application being made. Does the city have any sort of best practices, standards, or guidelines that they recommend for that outreach at all?
Well, it really depends upon the nature of the land use application and often the neighborhood. If we often do know what issues are of concern in different neighborhoods of the city, and so we can provide some guidance to an applicant, and provide them contact information with neighborhood chairpersons, and encourage that kind of contact and outreach before making application. But there, is no standard one best practice in how you do that.
Commissioner Finch?
How do the codes of other municipalities in Snohomish County address supportive housing?
Most of them don't, except as a multifamily use, and I don't have that information with me. We did that research when we prepared the code amendment 3 years ago, and most of the cities did not differentiate between supportive housing and multifamily housing.
Okay.
Commissioner Lark?
I mean, is that a common occurrence, or do very few municipalities make that distinction? I mean, outside of just Snohomish County.
Yeah, I would say that it's becoming more common as we and other communities across the country are dealing with more complicated housing situations than we have in the past. But I would say, you know, just based on the research that we did a few years ago, that most communities do not call out supportive housing as a different type of land use than multifamily housing.
Commissioner Yanusak?
I guess I'm having a little bit of trouble, just kind of conceptually, the idea of, in point number 2, allowing single-family, basically allowing supportive housing in a single-family zone, and supportive housing, really, I can't imagine it being anything other than a multifamily type setting. Allowing it in a single-family zone, but consistent with a character of a single-family zone, when it is inherently not single-family. What does that, how does that work conceptually, the idea of making it consistent with a single-family zone? I'm not, I mean, other than, I guess, the size of the building and the shape of the building, is that what we're talking about?
It's more, yeah, it would have to do with design standards, so designed to be, you know, similar in appearance to single-family detached housing that would be permitted in that zone, or in some zones, as I mentioned, duplexes are permitted or townhouses are permitted. So if it was in one of the zones that allows townhouses, it would probably be, you know, more along that type of development pattern.
And that'd mean it would look like a townhouse, but actually house multiple, I mean, have multiple rooms and more people than just a single family? Is that?
Yeah,
I guess, would that be
that would be-
consistent, or when we say consistent, do we also mean limiting the number of people as well, a number of families?
Well, again, what we would anticipate is that, again, with publicly owned lands, most of them are going to be of any interest to a housing provider. At this scale, they'd probably be larger properties, therefore they would probably want to put more than just a few people living in it. In fact, under our current regulations, if all they wanted to put was just a few people within a single-family home, they can do that under our land use category adult family home. They're permitted anywhere in any single-family zone or multifamily zones as well. And so that, at that scale, you know, probably wouldn't be worth their effort to try to, you know, go through the process for supportive housing. Supportive housing would be on a grander scale than an adult family home. And so in the case of a property that is meeting single-family development standards, it would be designed to look more like single-family dwellings, duplexes, or townhouses, depending upon what that zone allows.
Thank you.
And maybe I'm thinking about this incorrectly, but I wasn't around in 2016, so I don't know what the discussion was, but what is the specific advantage of providing for supportive housing on municipally owned land or publicly owned land in a single-family zone, as opposed to in other multifamily zones or commercial zones where we seem to have plenty of land available? What's the specific reason behind providing for that loophole for publicly owned lands?
The reason for doing so was that in looking citywide at opportunities when the city was trying to cite supportive housing, we looked at all different types of zoning and properties and discovered that there were a number of publicly owned lands that might make for a site that's suitable for housing, supportive housing of that type of the scale that was anticipated. And so the code was amended to allow for that.
So expanded for that one particular purpose and only for public lands because of that?
Right.
Do we have any other questions?
Mine is
Commissioner?
parking, help me understand that. I mean, I know most of the people in that type of housing don't drive cars, but they have service providers that come and visit them. They have caseworkers, they have friends and relatives, hopefully. And what was used to determine what it would be, what the requirements that you specified would be for?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and see what our record shows from the discussions back in 2016. I don't recall how we arrived at that number, but we did modify that last year to account for on-site staff. Certainly you're correct that homeless people, disabled people don't have the rate of vehicle ownership or driving that standard multifamily does, and so, but how we came up with the 1 per 4 rooms, I'd have to go back and do some research.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions for staff? All right, seeing none, I think we're going to go ahead and open this up to public comments. And we have quite a few folks that would like to speak, so please be as clear and concise as you can. Christopher Anderson, could you please come up to the podium and state your name, address? Thank you.
Hello, my name's Chris Anderson. I live at 3211 Grand Avenue. So I think most of us know we're in a homelessness crisis right now, and what we're doing is not enough. We have to make changes as a society, and those changes cannot be putting up more barriers to building a homeless housing. Most of the proposed requirements I've heard today would either make homeless housing either more expensive to build or would de facto ban them from single-family and zoned neighborhoods. The loose parking requirements, for example, were highlighted, and I believe one of the reasons that was put in is because it's less expensive for nonprofits to build these type of buildings if the parking requirements are lower. To me, that's a good thing to have in our code. If we're actually gonna, as a city, build more homeless housing and get more homeless people into houses, our code should not be making housing the homeless harder or more expensive. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I pronounce anybody's name wrong, I apologize ahead of time. Kat Bartanen, could you please come to the podium?
Hi, my name's Kat Barton, and I live at 3702 Norton Avenue. And I would like to talk about the project specifically on Norton Avenue. The school district.
Excuse me.
Excuse me.
I have to interrupt for just a second, please. The hearing tonight is on supportive housing in single-family zones. If you want to talk about the school district's application to rezone the property, that will be the subject of a separate hearing at a separate time. And tonight, and I should have mentioned this earlier in my comments to the Planning Commission, you should avoid ex parte contact with anybody who wants to talk to you about that specific site and the rezone. You can talk about it in front of the public at a public open meeting like this. And so I a little bit reluctant to interrupt and state that, but the subject for tonight is really about the code and not so much about the merits of Housing Hope's application for a comprehensive plan amendment and rezone. I'm hoping that the public will limit it tonight to the code and not to the specific application that will be the subject of a different public hearing on a different evening. So
I do have a question about the code because I am aware that the project slated for Norton does not sound like it qualifies because it is scheduled for students and it's low barrier, which means there is no criteria for sobriety or drug use. And I don't see how that falls into the criteria of long-term residents.
Does the commission want comment from the staff?
Sure.
Okay, again, we're not talking about a specific application. We don't have an application from the school district or from Housing Hope for supportive housing on this site. We don't have that information. That might be something that Housing Hope or the school district would want to talk to the neighborhood about separately, but we don't have that information. It's not something that we really can answer tonight.
Okay.
So for clarification, just so, because I'm a little confused right now too. So there is a rezone application for the Norton ball fields that's been submitted into the to the planning department. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it's been scheduled. And that is a project-specific. What we're discussing right now is the conditional use permitting process that would have allowed a conditional use process had that been the chosen venue, and the merits of that process. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
But we
So
do not have an application
right, so.
for a conditional use permit.
Right, so the point being that what we're trying to figure out at this point is this what council has asked a planning commission to look at is this a proper review process for this type of supportive housing?
In single-family zones,
In
correct.
single-family zones. So if we could please limit comments to that specific question, that would be of great help. We're not going to talk about a particular project at this time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and call up Earl Hall. If you could please come to the podium.
Yeah, my name's Earl Hall. I live at 3425 Colby Avenue. And basically, I just had three things I wanted to bring to the Planning Commission's attention on this issue. Last year, the Washington Legislature passed Bill 2382 that basically said this is a public benefit, sort of statewide as a priority. Let's take public property and use that for public benefit, which includes affordable housing. The second is, in terms of a best practice, I wish we had it here. British Columbia Housing has a best practice on community acceptance of affordable housing. And one of the things that they did is they compared, one of the concerns you hear for single-family housing, or for this type of thing in single families, is going to ruin housing values. They did a study, this one I have right here just compares 4. And it did not happen. Actually, the housing values went up. They both looked at the specific neighborhood and then the city 2 years before, 2 years after affordable housing comes into the area. And it did not affect house values. And last is out of our most recent community needs assessment that just got published by the Community Service Advisory Council. The neighborhood in which a child grows up matters considerably to their future well-being. For example, they talk about different examples, but essentially, if we take, like these students or any student that's in an R1 zone, they've got a better chance of success than if we dump them downtown in some industrial zone somewhere. So I'm in favor of having supportive housing in R1 zones. I think our hearing examiner process will take care of mitigations on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Victor Harris?
Good evening, Victor Harris, 3017 Lombard in beautiful downtown Everett and part of the Port Gardner neighborhood. One of the members tonight asked about the wrong page. About the notification process. And I think the biggest issue right now for a lot of that has to do with the fact that public agencies are trying to dump constituent-owned properties. We own the school district, we own the city. This property belongs to the people, not to the school districts as business entities or the city. That's why I think it's important that those issues be brought to us early if somebody wants to put in a project. What changes to single-family zoning are appropriate? Basically none. We'll establish as R1s or R1s. Leave it at that. But changes will be made that are not beneficial to the community. Supportive housing can be provided in our designated development zones, especially Evergreen. We've got land out there that needs to be developed. We know what our vision is, and we need to move that forward rather than destroying single-family neighborhoods. And to that point as well, think about this, if we have full-time caretakers on the property 24/7, you're looking at 5 rooms right there for housing that staff, 8 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. That's a load. And parking must be a minimum of 1 space, 1 unit, with no exemptions or amendments. Too many families today are living in cars. This is a need to be addressed without having to forfeit an essential asset of your vehicle. The proximity to services is not a stretch, given that we do have good public transit from Everett Transit. I believe the City Council should review the process. I want to hold the decision makers accountable. Multifamily housing must be in zones currently zoned for multifamily. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Carol Jensen, could you please come to the podium?
Hi, I'm Carol Jensen. I live at 2522 Rucker Avenue. I am the coordinator of a group called Everett Faith in Action, a group of local faith leaders who support efforts to house our neighbors without homes. I'm speaking here tonight, though, as an individual in support of the existing ordinances and code related to supportive housing. Members of faith communities in Everett know firsthand the need for supportive housing for homeless adults and children in our city. We hear the stories of people who come to our food banks, to our meal programs, or who knock on the doors of our churches asking for help. And I think we all know that the need for housing is so much greater than the supply. We know there are children sleeping in cars in Everett, and this is something I think that all of us, no matter where we are on this issue, want to end. Members of faith communities also know firsthand that some of their neighbors have concerns about the impact of faith-based programs to serve neighbors in need on the quality of life in those neighborhoods. Many of the concerns raised at the City Council meeting on July 10th are understandable. Yet I believe that the existing process for review by a hearing examiner using the criteria in our Everett Municipal Code to address these concerns is adequate. I found the materials that were shared with us in the packet, which I read before I came here, very helpful in coming to this conclusion. I'm hoping the City Council will take input from this commission and reach the conclusion that there are mechanisms in place to balance the needs of the city as a whole for more supportive housing and the concerns of neighbors in specific areas where such facilities might be cited if the criteria can be met. Efforts to house those without homes in Everett need to be encouraged, not discouraged, and supportive housing projects that meet established standards will serve the well-being of our entire city. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. Elizabeth Koenig, could you please come to the podium?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Koenig. I live at 3516 Norton Avenue. I've lived in Everett since 1993. I want to talk about a few of those points that planning was asked to look at by the City Council. Inclusion of supportive housing in single-family neighborhoods. When other developers cannot build multi-unit apartments in R1 neighborhoods, why are nonprofit developers given free rein? Why do single-family neighborhoods have to accept zoning changes to accommodate this housing when the city already decided density will occur in the Metro Everett area? Also, what about neighborhoods in the historic overlays? Do these overlays mean anything to the planning department? The public notice process. The surest way to have a bunch of angry residents dead set against a project is to force it on them after an agreement has been made and expect them to accept it. There needs to be mandatory involvement with the community from the very beginning of such projects. Plans should be presented at a public meeting and community concerns should be heard and addressed. Public process for challenging these proposals. The ordinance is written in a way that there's very little option for residents to have any say in these projects because they are decided by the hearing examiner under review process 3. This needs to change. Impact on green space. With all of the rush to build in neighborhoods, I'd like to ask you to consider that with increased density comes increased stress, decreased feelings of connection, and increased frustration with noise, traffic, etc. People need room to decompress, meet, exercise, and play. Building on surplus land is going to take away open space that people currently use for these reasons. Developers must address impact on neighborhoods. I kind of combine this with sidewalks and safety. Single-family neighborhoods usually have narrow streets, sometimes have no sidewalks, and experience too much traffic as it is, with cars cutting through to avoid the bad traffic on the arterials. Supportive housing places rules on vehicles owned by residents, so there will be more pedestrians in danger of stressed-out drivers, unsafe sightlines, narrow streets, etc. Now I'm going to mention briefly the project which must not be mentioned, but I think it could apply to everything. To other projects. The Everett School District staff stated that children living in the currently planned housing would all be bused to the schools they had formerly attended. Imagine 70-plus children being picked up and returned by a number of separate vehicles every morning and afternoon of the week in an area with narrow streets and poor visibility. That's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you. If we could please not have any, we've got quite a few folks who'd like to speak. And again, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Ted Masharf? Sorry.
So this is a place where I make comments, because it's a little frustrating, I'll just say, because so often when we get together with like the public school board or whatever, we're talking and we don't hear back from you. So is there any way I can ask just questions about where things stand with these 10 points, or is this just a time to just make comments?
Are you talking about the project specific, or are
Yes,
you talking
yeah,
about the ordinance?
yeah.
Now's not the time to be talking about the project, I apologize. But if you want to talk about the ordinance, please.
Wind them into the ordinance.
Sorry?
Wind them into the ordinance.
Why what?
Put them into questions about the ordinance.
Okay. I'll say zoning issues need to address the needs of the people. What's the plan to supervise teens housed in dormitory sleeping arrangements? This goes to the issue around management of the sites. I've worked as a mental health counselor with low-income and homeless teens for 25 years. Homeless teens who suffer from poverty and impermanence escape their homes at a high rate when suffering from trauma. At the Cocoon House, my clients have informed me that when they are on the run, they head to the 7-Eleven down the street on Pacific or McDonald's on 41st Street in well-lit neighborhoods. In a single-family neighborhood, where do you expect teens to go? In fight-or-flight mode, they may very well be leaving the back side of the project, I'm assuming this project will be facing east, and crossing Norton feeling triggered, being in a foreign neighborhood while only exasperating their mental health, their state, will complicate their lives even more. I'm a little thrown off by the restrictions on today, but I just wanted to say, I talk about trauma, because trauma affects the teens, and putting teens in a quiet historical overlay area is not the right place. It is. The Cocoon House on Colby is a perfect place for them. They feel welcome, included, there's movement, for them to go and just feel at home. But in a single-family neighborhood, it's just not the right place. Thanks.
Fred Safstrom, could you please come to the podium? I want to take a moment and say we do want to hear from everyone about the Norton project. There will be a venue, an appropriate time for that. So, but tonight it's just easier in terms of comments and what we're dealing with. So,
Fred Sastrom, 717 Grand Avenue. In following this process, since the moratorium, it has become, quite clear to me that that ordinance was drafted with the Clares Place project front of mind at the time. It's also clear that the ordinance was not intended to be only for Clares Place. It clearly would apply to any other project that would meet that criteria. However, I think in hindsight and thinking about it, the ordinance can be improved. I think in particular, there's a very wide range of supportive housing projects. The Clares Place project is entirely different than the project that we are anticipating doing. The service requirement is entirely different for each of these projects. The nature of the residence is entirely different. The parking requirements would be entirely different. And I think the ordinance, while it very broadly would accommodate both projects, really provides almost no guidance to differentiate, one type of supportive housing project from another type of supportive housing project. So I support this process. I think that together we can improve this ordinance and make it better and make it so it fairly addresses all types of supportive housing projects. I think it's very appropriate in most cases, in normal cases, that these projects, that this ordinance provide guidance to the hearing examiner, who would be able to make decisions based upon that guidance. But there may be other unusual projects that would be appropriate to come to the City Council. If we're in a single-family neighborhood that is entirely a single-family neighborhood without any other nature surrounding it, and a developer were to want to come in and put a 10-story building in, it would be a hard stretch to say that would be compatible necessarily with that neighborhood. And it's probably something that the City Council may not want to empower the hearing examiner to permit without that coming back to the City Council for specific approval. Supportive housing projects are very difficult to create. This is the reason the state legislature adopted legislation that specifically permitted the donation of public land for this purpose. We're talking about public land that is surplus to the agency's current needs or projected future needs. And yet, that public property, even though it no longer is applicable to that agency's specific original intended use, can still be put to productive public use, and that's what this legislation permits. That's what the Clare Place project was based on. The ordinance was based on. And a donation of public land in creating a project that is extremely difficult to create can make all the difference in whether that project is made possible or simply is not possible. If this was easy to do, these projects would have been created a long time ago that would have served all this population that needs this. And it hasn't happened, and there's good reasons why not. So I want you to bear in mind that these donations are extremely valuable. They're serving a very valuable public purpose. And I want to conclude to say placing a supportive housing project or a multifamily project or low-income residents in a single-family neighborhood does not destroy a neighborhood. And I cringe a little bit when I hear comments that suggest otherwise. I grew up in a neighborhood that had a 114 unit, a single-family resident neighborhood on 47th Street here in Everett. We had a 114 unit apartment complex that was across the street from my parents' house. That was a low-income apartment. The Broadmoor Apartments, some of you may be familiar with it at the time. That's where my friends lived. That's where they were very much a part of our neighborhood. They made our neighborhood vital, and anybody who grew up in that neighborhood would say that that is the best neighborhood in this city to grow up in. So I want to disabuse anyone of the notion that multifamily housing or low-income housing would damage or hurt a neighborhood in any way. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Smith, could you please come to the podium?
Thank you. For the record, my name is Mark Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Consortium of Everett and Snohomish County. As such, I represent about 25 nonprofit affordable housers throughout the Snohomish County and some who work statewide. Housing Hope is one of them, but I'm not here as their paid advocate or anything like that. The underlying ordinance is very well crafted legislation, and I commend staff for the way it was written and the Everett City Council for passing it. The moratorium is certainly understandable to look at it, and I would encourage the Planning Commission and the Council to tweak it rather than tear it up and throw it out. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Making publicly owned surplus land available to nonprofit affordable housing providers is a public policy statement. It's a statement that says everybody deserves to live in a safe, stable, and affordable home. That the community at large is better off when everybody lives in a safe, stable, and affordable home. That's the public policy statement. That the highest and one of the highest and best uses of this surplus public land is as affordable housing. And that's even more true with the housing crisis we face right now. I would say that land makes up 20 to 30% of the cost of an affordable housing project. At these income levels, the lowest income levels, the private market cannot build housing for these folks. They simply cannot do it. It falls to the nonprofit affordable housing sector to build those with public support. That means federal funds, it means state funds, it means county funds, it means city funds. And when you have the ability to access a piece of land for free or at a very, very low purchase rate or rental rate, we compete, my members compete with the private market for land. And they can't compete. They can't raise rents to make up the cost of land, right? The rents are fixed. So it's critical that they have access to land like this, that it has been deemed surplus and is no longer germane to the mission of the organization that deemed it as surplus. I would just echo what Fred said about multifamily housing does not destroy a single-family neighborhood. I've lived in both. I can tell you that multifamily housing actually encourages the kind of Mayberry-esque neighborhoods that many of us grew up in the 60s and 70s, right? When you have a higher density, you have people who are always around, they're looking out for each other, they're running into each other at the supermarket, on the sidewalk, on the bus. It encourages an interaction and promotes a neighborhood feeling that you don't get in single-family neighborhoods, except for the 2 or 3 neighbors who live immediately around you. So there is, again, so I really struggled sitting back there about what I was going to say. That's why I'm so awkward up here this evening, because what I really want to say is we have to stop demonizing poor people. That's the bottom line, right? We fought a civil war. We did the civil rights movement, passed landmark civil rights legislation, the women's movement, protections for gay and lesbians. The only people it's still legal to actively discriminate against is poor people. And that is carried out in our land use laws over and over and over again. I testify at so many city council meetings. I was on the Linwood City Council for 8 years. As a council member, I've been on both sides. And when I hear council members or anybody else say we need to protect our single-family neighborhoods, my first question is always protect them from what? What are you protecting them from? And you need to look deep into your heart and answer that question in an honest way. I would say that with multifamily housing, with affordable housing, with low-income neighbors, you have an opportunity to befriend the neighbors, not banish them. You have an opportunity to embrace them and help them if need be, but to accept them as your neighbors. So as you look at this moratorium, I would encourage lifting the moratorium. If necessary, I would encourage tweaking the underlying code provisions. You can add some more definition to supportive housing. You can add some more definition to some of the design standards. Just don't make it so onerous that it makes it impossible to build. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea Tucker?
Hello. Andrea Tucker, 3330 Wetmore Avenue. I agree with Fred as far as there are different populations in supportive housing. And the moratorium that's standing right now and as it was written for one particular project. I was around in 2016 when that was written, and I was chair of the Council of Neighborhoods at the time, and we're very involved. And Mayor Stephenson at the time, Mayor Stephenson at the time was desperately searching to get people off the streets. And when he created that ordinance, it was specific to that project. The other projects that we talk about are not the same population. Cars, there are a lot of different, sorry, I'm nervous. There are a lot of different populations that supportive housing is discussing. Cocoon House is one of them. Some people have cars, some people don't. I know I can't discuss the Norton project, but another topic that I'd like to address is the value in neighborhoods. The Vancouver or British Columbia study, I don't know what the study was, that it didn't affect the values. If it doesn't affect the values, it affects buying decisions. I'm a realtor, I know that. If I showed you a home in certain neighborhoods and they were the same price, I bet you'd take the single-family neighborhood. So while it doesn't affect prices according to what they said, I don't know if I agree with that. I definitely know it affects buying decisions. And I'd like to, for you to really consider the purpose of the moratorium and consider that ordinance, because I think that they do need to tweak the ordinance if they're going to have it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg Williams?
Hi. I do live in a Mulberry-esque neighborhood, and it might happen to be somewhere close to Norton. My name is Greg Williams, 3529 Norton. I find it really offensive you guys are saying that we can't discuss this project, because this project is the only reason any of us are in this room today, is because that's what was brought to City Council to ask you to go through the reassessing this. I find it almost a waste of our time because of that. I mean, that's the only reason 80% of the people are here. But, so I do live in a Mulberry-esque house, and I remember in a meeting that discussed purchasing some property, they said a lot of people, 50% of their income is their house payment. Well, I'm one of those people. And it's very difficult to see a neighborhood change. We already have 2 Housing Hope buildings on our street, and I can say they're not the best neighbors. There have been hundreds of police calls, The last time I looked in the past 2 years, there have been over 50 fire department calls to those residents. They're noisy. There's a need for it. I agree with that. But doing a high-density population like that in an R1 zone, there are neighborhoods around here that took a really long time to get a historic overlay put on their properties. And something like this to move in there would change that historic environment, change what that neighborhood might be trying to preserve. I'm gonna have to actually put on my glasses to read any of my scribbles.
Mr. Williams, can I get you to state your name and address?
Greg
too?
Williams,
Sorry.
3529 Norton Avenue. So this code was designed for the Berkshire. I really agree with Fred too. Every one of them should be looked at in a different perspective. It shouldn't be such a broad thing, just like zoning would be for anybody else that would build there. I don't believe this needs to be a special thing, and I don't think the city council believes it either. That's why they've done this moratorium, to prove that it's not, shouldn't be so broad. I think it's a loophole, and that's how these people got this property that may or may not be on Norton. I think they should have to go through the normal zoning codes just as anybody else would. We have many empty buildings and areas near transportation and proper zoning to do projects like this. My concern would be traffic, pollution, open space being taken away. Once open space is gone, it will never come back. With the idea of Everett growing 50,000 people in the next 5 years or 20 years, whatever it is, aren't we going to need more schools? Why would we give away school property when we're going to need more schools to give education to these people? Why don't we think about saving school property and doing something with it that would help students? Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie Williams?
I'm Carrie Williams. I live at 3529 Norton. I'm not really going to say anything about any specific anything, just, and I wrote this kind of quick, so I believe there's a huge conflict of interest for any planning commissioners to be involved in any recommendations if they are involved in any of the supportive housing projects. I think they should recuse themselves from this process. This includes anyone on the commission who has worked or is working for or has spoken on behalf of any housing agencies that would benefit from upcoming supportive housing projects. This seems logical to me as well as ethical, and it might actually build some trust with the residents. So thanks.
So at this time, I've gone through. Are there any other members of the audience that would like to step forward and speak to this issue?
Hello, Paula Townsell. I live at 6115 Capri Place in Central Everett. I wasn't going to speak, but there have been so many exciting things mentioned tonight, I thought I would go ahead and talk about a few of them that are kind of near and dear to me. I do believe that when we learn how many sites exist in Everett that fit the criteria, where they're located, especially in regard to the single-family siting, we can have a much more interesting and applicable conversation. I am concerned that we're speaking in so many generalities. I did participate in the conversations in 2016 on the Berkshire property. I was surprised at that time that we didn't look at where the other sited locations could be placed throughout Everett. When we talk about Berkshire, it is a very good example of supportive housing where it can blend into a single-family use zone. In that, also, for example, schools and other educational facilities are allowed through a conditional use process within single-family neighborhoods. It doesn't in any way mean that they look like houses. It means that they're sited in a way where they can be placed through whatever tools we have within our planning tool belt. Compatibility is built with a variety of planning best practices. The units can be built up to allow the density to minimize their footprint. We can allow greater green spaces, and we can have larger setbacks. We have stringent design standards that are also greater when in a single-family than if you were developed just a single-family residential house, which rarely does have the design standards that a supportive housing project would require. The exception to that might be with specific overlays. I would encourage the siting of the supportive housing near the transit routes. When we talk about locating them near services versus near the transit routes, I would encourage all of you to look back at what was talked about by the public when we did it in 2016. You will find that brought people out en masse. The huge issue from downtown and the North Everett folks was that they were inundated with the support services, and to have the housing that was placed on Berkshire placed in North Everett would be wholly unacceptable to them. You also ran into the same thing with the people in Central Everett who said, we're inundated with it. So to put them in our neighborhood is a real problem too. The only people who didn't show up was anybody from South Everett, because at that point they hadn't been threatened to have a supportive housing location yet. I think we need to know where the opportunities are for supportive housing. I think we need to have a transparent conversation with the citizens of Everett coming in and knowing that on this map there are 12 locations and each of the neighborhoods are going to be affected by those. Let's talk about it before that opportunity comes up, before somebody's going to the work to put a project in place in those neighborhoods. Let's talk about how we accommodate these types of uses in all neighborhoods. Also for parking, because that's a real issue with supportive housing. People need to understand that parking is determined by national experiences, by local comparisons, and it's conducted by traffic engineers who are professionals. Our code has been successfully addressing the building of parking requirements since the inception of the code, and it's also updated as needed and when standards change nationally. So we don't have to guess at whether people in supportive housing use more car parking spots than others, use fewer than others. We actually statistically know there's actually professionals who can provide us with that information. I think my last point, and I think this one's really probably my strongest and best point that I just want everyone to know, and think twice before you open the door to having City Council review land use projects. That could not even in your wildest dream be a good idea. You have to understand that a hearing examiner is a qualified professional who can oversee a quasi-judicial process and is not subject to the election whims and political whims that come with those positions. Councils lean left, councils lean right, they lean forward-thinking, and sometimes, in my experience, they've leaned very backwards in their thinking. But let's not let them be making our neighborhood land use decisions that we live with for the rest of our years in our community. I've lived in Central Everett for over 25 years. I lived in North Everett probably 14 years before that. I intend to live in Everett for a long time, and I really like the 1980s idea of a hearing examiner in our city. So please consider that when you're making your recommendations to our city council. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I do.
Come on.
Hi, my name is Susan Mossart. I live at 1112 Clinton Place in Everett, Washington. I want to emphasize, and it's mostly a question I've had for a really long time about planning in Everett in general. It has nothing to do with anything but the bigger plan. And part of that is that we have 3 historic neighborhoods. Do we want to keep them? Do we love them? Do we want to keep them? Are they important to us? Because if they are, then perhaps zoning, it's not just R1 zoning. It's R1 zoning in a historic neighborhood. If those things are not important, I think we need to bring it to the people of this community. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mitchell Kotlik. I live at 3520 Norton Avenue. I really appreciate all the points that everyone's brought up today. It's very eye-opening and enlightening to see all the perspectives that everyone has. And I really commend you guys for taking the time to look at this, or use the moratorium to look at the ordinance and understand kind of some of the bigger picture. And I really think it's important when we think about, we've made a lot of comments about the building a neighborhood that everyone enjoys being at, that does vary greatly in that definition of supportive housing. And even from a parking standpoint, there's supportive housing where, yes, there's going to be very limited parking needs, but we're also talking about supportive housing that we're encompassing and building this Mayberry neighborhood, which is going to be a very different type of supportive housing that is likely to have more cars. If you're running into them on the buses, at the grocery stores, they're getting there somehow. They have a bigger family. They have people coming to visit. So again, I really want to push that we focus on there's different degrees of supportive housing. And by just throwing a mass of people into a single family residence might not make sense depending on the type of supportive housing you're doing. So I, again, really appreciate taking a look at this. And I think that broad definition can kind of put us into a gray area where we can unintentionally make decisions that affect us at a really long-term scope that we should maybe try to narrow down on. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that about covers it. Is there any other members of the audience that want to speak to this item? And with that, I think we'll go ahead and move on to item number 2, which is supportive housing and single-family zones. What? Did I miss it? There's a next step.
This is Alan Giffen, Planning Director. I wanted to just see if there are any, following the public comments and the discussion that you heard tonight, any direction for staff for the September 17th public workshop, where we'll try and follow up on some of the points that we've already heard. But if there's any additional information that you would like, we'd like to hear that if you can tonight.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Yes, I tend to agree with Ms. Townsell in her assessment that it would be useful to actually have a map, presuming it's a finite number of sites that we're talking about, to see just how many and where they are, these publicly owned sites that are in single-family neighborhoods. A couple of other ideas that occurred to me, and perhaps they were considered and thrown out 3 years ago when you were putting this ordinance together. One would be to, instead of having it available in all R1 or single-family zones, have it only in the higher density single-family zones, limit it to there. Another little tweak that might be worth considering or looking into is opening it up to non-publicly owned land if it's adjacent to a commercial, industrial, or multifamily zone. So if there's properties that are essentially on the edge of an R1 district rather than potentially in the middle, depending on where the public sites are, that might open up some additional sites that would compensate for eliminating sites that are in the lower density single-family zones. Just a couple of thoughts that occurred to me. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask if the staff would be able to do some further research on the methods that used in BC for public outreach and public engagement, and bring those into the conversation as well. Thank you.
I guess I'd just say two things that kind of sparked my interest. There was a couple speakers who mentioned something about the state statute that passed. I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if that has any bearing on the conversation, but maybe even just including that in the package, and maybe some more information about that. And I guess what I'm hearing and I think is a big concern and makes sense to me is the idea of how to differentiate projects. And I think that a lot of that comes down to the hearing officer, and that's the hearing officer is tasked with helping make those decisions and guide those. But I wonder if maybe it could be helpful to have some additional, I don't know, focus or some additional discussion specifically about those standards and kind of how that process works, and maybe help to shed some light on that, because I think maybe if there was some better understanding about that, we could have maybe a more informed conversation, and maybe not fear that process as much or be curious about how that works. And then I don't know, one other thing, I don't know, with regard to the city council involvement in that, I don't know is there an appeal process to the city council with the hearing examiner, or is there possibly some sort of hybrid process where the hearing examiner hears it, and then if there's an appeal, it could go to the council or something like that?
No, the hearing examiner process is appealable to Superior Court.
Okay. So then I don't know, maybe if there is concern about involving council, or if council wanted to get involved, if there's some sort of, I don't know, hybrid some sort of stem that could be added to it to maybe include them for some sort of, I don't know, necessarily decision-making, but at least some input in that as well.
There's some limitations under state law, but we can get you
Perhaps.
that information.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Finch?
I wanted to first thank all the public who provided testimony tonight. It's asking a lot to spend a nice summer evening in here talking about this, but it's an important and complex topic. Commissioner Zelinski's suggestion of a map is a very good one. I think that because there's obviously a need for this kind of housing, we should also understand the availability of non-single-family sites as well that are publicly owned that could also provide for this kind of housing. Because it's important to understand the question in front of us I think with understanding the capacity elsewhere. So that would be a helpful map for me to see.
Yes. So I have a question for Alan. Just to confirm something that, because of what was said here, the hearing examiner does take comments from the public on specific projects, correct?
That is correct.
Yes. And just one suggestion, I'd like to rethink the 500 feet proximity to traffic. I think the quarter mile seems more reasonable.
Any other?
I think I concur with Michael on the map of properties, but also could we do an overlay of the transit zones? You know, where there is transit close to those properties and where there isn't, so we can really make some.
Anyone else? So I actually have a quick comment too, because I think the idea of this map is really good. But what I'd be interested in finding out is how many single unit residential properties that we're talking about. So how many are they going to affect with a conditional use process? I mean, are we talking about a few properties, or are we talking about a lot of properties? Because in my mind, single family it's a pretty, the character of the area has already been well established. And to change that, I think there's a lot more considerations that go on in that process than perhaps a multifamily area and things of that nature. So I think Ms. Townsend's suggestion is on the mark, and I think it would be very beneficial to know how many properties are we talking about in the city that would be impacted if single family was removed from the conditional use process. Any other questions? All right. Sorry, I steamrolled earlier. Now we will move on to item number 2. We'll take a pause too, so folks can leave if they'd like to.
Let's see if I,
So it should be,
back to slideshow mode.
go down here and you can pull up yours.
Okay.
And then, yeah. Hi.
So I really can't.
All right, we're going to call it back to order at this time.
Here's your gavel.
I don't feel the need to use that. So item number 2, ReThink Zoning, Commercial and Industrial Zones. Dave, is that you? All right.
Turn that on. Now for something completely different. Different type of zoning. So this is a workshop on proposed consolidation of commercial, business, and industrial zones. And this is sort of the next step in rethinking zoning, streamlining our development regulations, simplifying the code. So what I'm going to do tonight is just review the maps. This information is really intended to supplement what's in the Planning Commission packet, which is basically the nuts and bolts of what we're proposing in terms of the zone concepts for each individual zone. So what I was hoping to do was provide sort of kind of a photo tour mainly of development that's out there around the city. So I was able to get out and take a number of pictures. I've got the proposed zoning maps, which are also in your packets, posted in the front of the room here. And then I also wanted to highlight for industrial areas the sort of the differences between parts of the city, North Everett, South Everett, and why we came up with a little bit different concept from what you had originally seen a couple of months back. And that falls in with existing industrial zone standards. Also, auto dealerships. That's always something we like to step back, take a look at. Auto dealerships take up a huge inventory or a huge portion of the commercial zone inventory out there, and so we'd love to get your thoughts and ideas about some of the standards for auto dealers. So to start out with business and commercial, we've got 10 existing zones and one overlay. That's the clinic office overlay. There's just a remnant of that that's left now along Colby Avenue, south of Metro Everett. So we think we can consolidate the zones, plus get rid of the overlay, but still keep the spirit and intent of the provisions in that overlay through a street designation. So here are 3 zones. Neighborhood business, that's essentially your current B1 with a couple of exceptions. And then the business zone, which would be sort of your general commercial. And that would include areas in corridors such as along Evergreen Way, Everett Mall Way, and the little forgotten area down there at Murphy's Corner and 19th Avenue Southeast and 128th. Oh, I should back up. I forgot the UM zone. So that's sort of an extension of current UM zoning for Metro. We think we can extend the Metro concept to include parts of these corridors along Everett Mall Way, Evergreen Way, and then parts of 19th Avenue Southeast as well. Those areas are typically, well served by transit. We think we can have a little bit higher level of design standards there, maybe some additional restrictions on uses that wouldn't apply to the business zone. So getting into some of what's out there now, this is Broadway, and these are areas currently within the BMU zone that have developed under the BMU standards. And so you can see the coffee store on the left, that's a newer one. You can see the wide sidewalks and landscaping. Then you've got the community health center, which is, I can't remember the cross street there. That's also, pardon? 15th Street. That also was developed under BMU. You can see the wider sidewalk along with street trees along adjacent to the building there. And then you have a Starbucks further north up at 10th, which was also developed under BMU. And so sort of some of the hallmark standards of BMU are the landscape requirements as well as a 8-foot sidewalk. So we'd like to hear your input on whether we should carry some of those standards across to the new zoning that would apply, which would be there's existing BMU corridor, and then we would propose to change that to UM, so urban mixed. And that would extend from the existing boundary of UM at 25th Street down at the bottom of the picture there. Looking at Silver Lake, a few examples of development in that area. And so you've got a medical office. This is just right off of 19th Avenue Southeast across from the Silver Lake Center. I worked on that one a number of years ago. That kind of is a good representative example of some of the professional medical offices that are down in that area. There are a number of them. To the right, Freeway Center, that's a little shopping center at 112th and I-5. And I took this close-up here because it kind of illustrates some of those little things that seem to work pretty well in commercial developments. You can see sort of the ornamental lighting there on the wall. You see the canopies, weather protection. You can see plenty of transparency glazing out here. And so those are some standards that we think really help to improve the overall design and appearance. You also see a pretty wide sidewalk there in front of the building. So those are some positive things. Oops. There we go. More Silver Lake pictures. Upper left, again, that's a different shot of the freeway center at 112th and I-5. Another probably underused shopping center that's just to the right on 19th Avenue Southeast on the west side. Then down below, you've got the Silver Lake Center with its very large, expansive asphalt and a non-conforming freestanding sign. And then lower left, another little medical office that's just kind of tucked away there back, I think that's just north of Costco. And you see a number of these little places that are tucked in off some of the side streets that extend off the west side of 19th Avenue Southeast. Now moving to Everett Mall Way. A lot of stuff out here, both good and bad. Most of it developed without any design standards. So you've got several zones currently that have basic standards for setbacks, landscaping, signage, things like that, but really no standards in terms of buildings or site layout. So Trader Joe's is kind of tucked away back in there, doesn't have very good signage. They put a little sandwich board sign out there. Easy to visualize, kind of a monument sign right there. To the right of that, that's not very good resolution because I took that on the move, but that's a building with two blank walls. And we do have standards in other zones that kind of discourage that. We think probably need to carry some of those standards across to this area in terms of basic building design to avoid that situation. And the development down to the lower left here, it looks pretty good, but it's got the parking lot kind of in front and the buildings are in back, and it's kind of hard to see, especially with the landscaping there. And so one of the standards that we incorporated with the revisions to the parking code was to not allow for parking between the building and the street, which has the effect of pushing the building up and putting the parking either behind or to the side. So we think that might be a good idea to apply to places like Everett Mall Way as well. Everett Mall Plaza. So this is on the north side of Everett Mall Way. We all know the former Toys R Us store. Just a big empty building, big empty parking lot, a lot of underutilized space out there. And then there's another building here. I think this might be the former Olive Garden, which is vacant as well. So between those two buildings, you've got a lot of unused space out there. This is a shopping center that was developed probably in the 80s, late 80s, something like that. And so it's starting to show its age. It's also got some access and visibility issues, which we probably can't, address as part of our zoning effort, but we can look at permitted uses. And so if we turn this area to more of a mixed-use designation, it might allow for better utilization of some of these back lots where there's no direct exposure on on the main street, but yet you're far enough away where maybe a residential use would make sense given the separation from the street. And then of course Walmart, they're always busy, so they had the busiest parking lot in the shopping center. So this is just sort of the Everett Mall and vicinity overview, currently zone C1R. This is a Google Earth image, and so you see the mall at the lower right, and then Everett Mall Plaza is above that, and then you've got some smaller shopping areas over to the left side of the picture. So We would propose to take that to urban mixed, which would, again, maybe allow for a little bit more flexibility in terms of the uses, including residential, although I do believe residential is allowed in C1R right now. But it would potentially incorporate some new design standards for this area. Now, auto dealerships, I'm not going to show all of them just because there's too many, but this is an important sort of a cluster right along Evergreen Way at Everett Mall Way. You've got a number of dealers out here. These are all large lots, large properties, big buildings. And so it seems to be fairly successful. The dealerships seem to do well when they locate in proximity to each other, as opposed to the odd lot, which is, off by itself. I think maybe Rodland's an exception there. That they've been pretty successful over the years, and there aren't too many dealerships down that way. There's a few. I think there's the Chevrolet dealership also. So existing zoning is E1, and then there's a pocket there. I think is that Dwayne Lane's property that has the C1 contract. So we would propose to eliminate the contract rezone that's out there, as well as all of the contracts that we possibly can while we're at it. We have to look at that jointly with legal. Many of those sites have been developed under the contracts, and we need to evaluate the permitted uses and how that would change under zoning, the development status of the property as part of that review. But certainly the contracts create a layer of complexity, which we would love to get rid of. And so proposed zoning would be business. At this point, we do not have any specific recommendations to change our rules on auto dealerships. I guess some things that we could look at would be, for example, minimum lot size. Do we want to encourage the larger dealerships that can make or can afford to do more expensive site improvements versus the smaller ones, which maybe struggle on a day-to-day basis, and we have more compliance issues with them. As far as current standards, they're permitted on Evergreen, Broadway, Everett Mall Way. You can see the zoning categories where dealerships are permitted. There are performance standards, so for example, the service shops need to be facing away from residential zones to minimize noise impacts. And then stored materials need to be enclosed and so on. So again, we're not really proposing any significant changes to auto dealerships. We would not propose to have them allowed in the UM zone at this point, but only within the business zone. So that would not include Broadway. I believe we do not currently allow auto dealerships in the BMU zone.
Dave, can I
Yes.
ask you a quick question on that topic? Because I know there's a lot of auto dealerships down in Seattle now that are actually going up instead of out with their facilities.
Right.
So I'm just going to highlight that because you're eliminating them, and that might be an opportunity to actually get rid of the sea of concrete that comes with a lot of dealerships, that they're becoming much more urbanized. So I'm just going to kind of highlight that for you because I know there's been a few of those structures that have built down in Seattle.
That's a good point. I know Toyota may be one of those down around South Seattle, so just south of downtown. Yeah.
One of the districts as well.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even tell though. They sing perfectly. Yeah.
Of course, land values might be slightly different down that way.
What? True. I do have one quick question.
Yes, please.
The biggest distinction I see between business and the urban mix is the authorization of auto sales. Did I miss anything else? I'm looking around, like the amount of residential being used, the general development standards, you know, what are some of the finer details that separate these two? Because if really it's just authorization of auto, why can't we do that with just the conditional use, given the fact that there's very little business? And
Yeah, and there's, there are other uses that kind of go along with automobile-dependent uses. So you've got the dealerships, you've got businesses with drive-throughs, you've got, what are some more examples? Auto-related retail, which at this point would not be permitted the way we've put together the UM zone, so there are some additional uses. Another distinction between UM and business would be the level of design. And so if we take the metro standards that we currently have for the UM zone and apply those more broadly to other parts of the city, that would be sort of raising the bar, so to speak, in a lot of those zones and creating slightly higher design standards.
Alan Giffen, Planning Director. Also, with the exercise that we went through in 2012, establishing the Evergreen Way zoning that was to support the bus rapid transit stations that were established in that area, we currently have kind of a hopscotch pattern. So around the bus rapid transit stations, we have what's called the mixed-use overlay. And so what we're talking about here would not be a great change from what it currently exists in the mixed-use overlay. And so instead of being mixed-use overlay, it would be urban mixed. And then the areas that don't have that mixed-use overlay would be the B zones. And those are areas where the auto-dependent type uses are allowed. And so the idea is that around the bus rapid transit, we did not want to encourage or we wanted to encourage transit-oriented development so that it was help support the transit investment that's been made there.
I would think big box stores would fit into that category too. wouldn't they?
Exactly, yeah. Those would be allowed in B
In B, but
business,
not in
in
UM.
UM. I believe, I'll have to double check that.
unless they were like mixed use, I mean, like Safeway on the bottom and 5 stories above, right?
Right.
As you're looking at eliminating, where would those folks go? Because they are a very large revenue generator for the city. So if in 10 years or 20 years it makes sense for them to move out like other auto dealers have done, where in the city would those folks go?
Yeah, I don't think we're really proposing to make them non-conforming. They basically were, at this point, trying to...
I got you, but at a certain point in time, they're gonna look at their ROE and they're gonna go, I put up 500 units here, I can make more money on that. Where would they then go that would be zoned for them so that we don't lose? I mean, at one point in time, auto dealers were one of the top 3 tax generators for the city.
And they still are. I think one of the top tax generators. I think you probably go to the urban model that was mentioned with the multi-story rather than the 10-acre sites. We don't have the 10-acre sites available in the city for relocating or really establishing just about anything anymore. And so as we get more density, fewer vacant parcels, higher land values, you probably would see that more urbanized model that was mentioned in Seattle. And again, we're not proposing to change the standards.
I heard you. I might have stated it wrong, but it's, when it's time to evolve to the next, we need to make sure we've got some place to put them because, and then there's design standards that they have to build to, Ford dealer's got to look like this and a Chevy dealer and all that kind of stuff that.
Yeah. If their corporate standards say that they need 15 or 20 acres, it's just not going to happen in Everett.
Commissioner Lark?
Follow-up question, thinking about the future, thinking about the evolution of this and, I part of me thinks that there won't need to be as much space for car dealerships because we won't be buying a larger number of cars. Why would I buy a car when I could rent it from, get a driverless service for less per month? So that brings me to another question. Those will still need to be maintained, and will the maintenance of vehicles fall under that auto use function without a dealership. So if you
Yes.
need to have a repair shop in the city, you can do that.
Correct. Repair shops would still be permitted in the business zone. I don't know that they would be allowed in the UM. I don't think they currently are permitted in UM. Is that correct? Or maybe on certain streets, but not others? I think it's based on street designation. So no, we would not zone repair shops or ancillary activities, auto-related activities out. They would still track along with dealerships. Anything else on auto dealerships, auto-related uses? Okay. Also I have one slide on the B1 zone. These are the small little pockets of neighborhood business zoning. A lot of times you'll find the corner grocery store. So you've got one example there, top right is the grocery and deli down near the Mukilteo boundary off the boulevard. You've got the Lucky Market. Obviously that one's been there a while, so they haven't really designed it to be sort of compatible so much with some of the surrounding. They have ample signage. And then the example to the upper left there, that's a dental office on Madison Street on the north side. To me, that's a good example of how a small business can blend in a neighborhood. Because you see the house behind that, that's in a residential zone. So you've got, pretty low-key looking business, nicely landscaped, maintained. Parking is to the left, which is away from the residential zone. So this is the kind of thing we would sort of hold up as model and say, this is kind of what we're striving for with our neighborhood business standards. Try to encourage compatibility, maybe a little bit more design in the buildings and site than we have currently, which is almost none. Again, it's one of those zones where we have basic setbacks, parking, landscaping, but no real design that goes with that. So we might be able to raise the bar a little bit in those standards.
I do have a quick question. So with the intent for the neighborhood business zone, are we talking about kind of, tools to catalyze areas or tools to preserve existing businesses there? I'm just kind of curious on that side because, I don't think, looking at some of the height settings, and, if we're looking to put restaurants, coffee shops, like small neighborhood nucleuses there, these people are, it's not high transit, not high parking. It's going to be dependent exclusively on people walking there from the given area, about a half-mile radius. I mean, having worked in the restaurant industry, I don't see, a lot of these places that have been identified as just being viable to do any of that. Have we talked to the business community about some of those development standards for these neighborhood businesses, what they need,
Yeah, at this point, we haven't done outreach to the business community. I think the broader outreach will happen through this process. We don't have, for example, any business focus groups or anything like that. I would probably leave that to Alan to make any determination on that.
And one of the things that's really challenging now is just the whole retail environment. We've seen that retail stores used to be like the little Lucky Market there. Those things used to be more viable in neighborhoods, but so many of them have gone out of business in Everett. A lot of those are actually in residential zones, and some of them have transitioned to other non-residential uses. Some of them just make lousy buildings for housing, and even though they're zoned residential. But that is something that is really a challenge. Even in the bigger boxes like the Toys R Us, for example, was a very busy business for years, but the whole nature of retail is changing to where we will probably have to take a deeper look at what we end up using a lot of our commercial zoning for in the future. Fortunately, most of our zoning for the commercial zones allows for a variety of things, including housing. So you could have mixed use, you could transition it to very high density type of redevelopment. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the use of commercially zoned properties in the future, just because of a lot of the traditional use as retail is just not viable any longer.
I mean, yeah, I'm a big fan of the small corner bodega. Some of my favorite memories in DC is, forgetting, like, I need an ingredient for dinner, running to them, and them being a lifesaver. And I'd always be really confused because they would have some of the most basic materials, and then they would have caviar on one corner, and I have no idea why. So I see the need for them, and I want for me, I would be I have not only just a slight emotional attachment to seeing them exist and be successful here, but I think they serve a very valuable function as well.
So moving on to industrial zones, there's our existing zoning, so a total of 6 if you include urban light industrial, and that makes perfect sense given what we're proposing to do with new zoning. And this is, again, a little bit different from the original concept, which I think David might have brought in a couple of months back, where we had one light industrial zone. So the idea was to lump, C2, MM, M1, ULI into one zone. And then have the heavy industrial zone include both the M2 and MS zones. But as we started to go through the various standards in those zones, we encountered some problems in terms of reconciling those standards and creating one single zone with that encompasses, so many highly varied development standards. So some of those include minimum lot size, setbacks, and landscaping. Your standards were all over the board. So how do you create one zone that encompasses all of that? So in this chart, the C2 and the M1 zone, you can see lot size requirement, that's a minimum lot size, 5,000 square feet in C2 and 5 acres in M1. Similarly, front setback, totally different, 0 versus 30 feet, building height, not so much. And then if you go down under lot size for MM and ULI, you see, again, sort of wide variation in what those minimums are. So how do you create one zone that covers so much land that has developed under different standards? And the answer is you can't. You really need 2 zones. So that's why we came up with L1 or a LI1 and an LI2. And examples here, North Everett. So it's got its own character. It really does. This is down off of Hill Street, Cedar Street, Pine down there. See the freeway in the background on that top slide. I think that's driving straight down Hill Street. You can see buildings kind of right up close to the street, parking right off the street. I mean, the street is really part of the development in those areas. It's used for loading, it's used for parking, circulation, not much landscaping, not much greenery, again, 0 setbacks for the most part. So that's what you get. It just looks really different from other industrial areas. This is Crystal Light from the back and from the front. Again, pretty stark. It was developed under the C2 zone, so really no design standards there. They did make an attempt to put a canopy there, but I don't think it even covers the public sidewalk, so it's ornamental. So you compare that, the existing industrial development in North Everett with Southwest Everett. Whoops, sorry, that's got a hair trigger. And it's totally different character. You've got wide streets, you've got big, broad setbacks, you've got lots of green, you've got large parcels where trucks can access, circulate, and deliver on-site. They don't need to use the street other than, basic to and from. And so it not only is the look and feel different, but the function is different out in Southwest Everett. So it really deserves another zone. So we gave this the LI2, Light Industrial 2 designation. The uses in those 2 designations would be similar, with one exception in the LI1, which is North Everett. That would model the ULI zone where residential would be permitted. So just within Metro, residential would be permitted in that LI1 zone.
Quick question, before you go on to, I just want to kind of follow up and kind of challenge the idea that we precluded housing from the other light industrial zones as well. I mean, I don't, like, what was the staff thought and decision behind that? Because, I mean, there's...
I'll talk to that. We've had, over the years, pretty strong support for a policy that's in the comprehensive plan to preserve industrial land for industrial uses. That's actually being even more strongly reinforced by the, excuse me, the regional Vision 2050 policy plan that is calling for the same thing. You know, we were maybe out ahead of some of our neighboring communities throughout the region in restricting non-residential uses in industrial zones. And so now it's going to be more of a mandate that industrial centers would be very restrictive when it comes to non-industrial uses, even for some of the commercial uses. So things like a Costco would not be able to go into an industrial zone under regional policies. And so those are some things that we've already got in our policies.
If I may, though, I mean, I am 110% behind the idea of preserving industrial space. I think we need it. I don't think we have enough of it here in the city and in the county, but I also kind of want to push back on this traditional notion that you can't put housing above contemporary factories, especially a lot of other uses done in industrial areas, distribution centers. I mean, you know, we have a very finite shortage of land. And, you know, other cities, Atlanta is looking at, you know, how they can mix in light industrial and residential in mixed use capacities. Battleground Washington is doing the same thing. I think it's worth having that conversation because not only that, if we do it right, we can expand that base of industrial land to places where we have more space in the city to do that. You know, it's, you know, I mean, if we find a good balance and a good set of policies, we can find more places for industrial work to occur and also mitigate a lot of the challenges that come with getting workers to industrial spaces as well.
Something we can look at probably more in line with the comprehensive plan update scheduled for 2023.
Okay, good. I have some additional reading material for it. Thank you.
So just to your point, so residential would be allowed in areas currently designated ULI, and then change to LI1. It may be that if we could track that over time and see what the demand is, and if there's additional demand in the future, there are other areas, you know, maybe focus it in North Everett to some of those areas that are currently C2 or something. That would be, you know, one way to. Yeah, served by transit. Yeah, transit access is important. You do have less of that out in Southwest Everett. And I did just want to point out this one example. This is a building I worked on probably 10 or 15 years ago out on the former Associated CSR Cemex property, part of their redevelopment. And so there's an M1 zone here currently, and it requires building modulation. So the building has to be offset every, I think it's 60 feet, something like that. So the developer said, well, we don't want to do modulation, but I'll do stained concrete out here. And I thought, I don't know if that's going to achieve the intent of the modulation requirement. So we did grant a modification of the standard. And this is how it looks. It looks great. The building looks really good. They landscaped the heck out of it. They've done a really good job of maintaining it, and so, you know, I think they did a really good job with this one. And it also goes to the point of, you know, maintenance. I think maintenance and landscaping are sort of two of the common denominators of good development. You don't necessarily have to do a whole lot with the building, but if you landscape it and you maintain it over time, you know, that makes all the difference in the world. So sort of general guiding principles in terms of how planning is kind of approaching the zoning model here, or redoing the commercial industrial zones. Number one, don't reinvent the wheel. Take what you've got and build on it in terms of your standards, and take the best standards, apply them more broadly, take the standards that aren't working so well and, don't use them. Maybe use Metro as our model for some of the permitted uses. So we would adopt the Metro permitted uses more broadly to the city, to the rest of the city, as well as some of the building design standards. For example, sort of building form, placement, transparency standards, weather protection, those type of things. And then retain some of those unique standards that we currently have for zones that would go away. And that would be, for example, the E1 and the Broadway mixed-use zones. We talked a little bit about that. Eliminate zones that don't have standards. There are about 3 or 4 of those currently. And try to create some level of consistency. For example, the window transparency standard. Different zones have different requirements, so maybe we could standardize that across different zones. There's an opportunity there. So that's all I have at this point.
All right. Does anybody have any questions? And I want us to be mindful, we've got about 10 minutes before we would have to take a vote on extending the meeting.
I have one. When you mix, I'm with Alex that we need to mix residential, but who wins the war of backup alarms on your forklift as an example? Noise standards of starting a shift at 5 o'clock in the morning and have it going 24 hours. And, you know, we need to be cognizant of those. I mean, we have a project we're doing right now in Issaquah where we have to turn our alarm off on our truck when we're backing up. And we got a $2,500 fine from L&I. So do we satisfy L&I and maybe not run over somebody? Or do we meet the development standards that were set by the developer to get his building permit? So that just nuances like that, we want to make sure that we're looking at what those other things are so we don't end up with
Compatibility issues. In an industrial zone, there's a different noise standard than there would be for a residential zone. And so a higher ambient level of noise is permitted in an industrial zone. So that might not preclude.
what happens when you mix the two? Who wins?
Well, it would still be an industrial zone. It would be an industrial zone designation and carry the same noise limitations that today's industrial zones have. So
I mean, it's just nuances like that we need to
that's
make sure we don't set ourselves
to me,
up
that's
for.
more of a buyer beware thing. You know, you're gonna buy an industrial zone.
Wait a minute, we just had a group of those folks leave.
Just an observation, I think it would be useful to reach out to the commercial realtors and sort of bounce it off of. I'm sure they will have some questions and some issues that we may not be able to think of, that because they're dealing with this every day.
We have one at the end of the desk.
True. I might also recommend running these design standards by economic development, making sure that the kind of inquiries they're receiving are consistent with the kind of standards that you're proposing. I want to make sure we're pushing the right businesses in the right locations throughout the city.
Sure. And at the next level, so I think we're going to be bringing this back to you in a couple of months. So we'll have the standards more formed, and that'll be a good time to do that outreach.
Great.
Yeah, so we're talking about redevelopment for housing, and we have all those parking lots along Everett Mall Way and those vacant buildings, and so I guess you were saying only just establishing design standards for that area might encourage a more appropriate use of the area? That's about what we can do?
Yeah, I think opening up to more than just commercial uses, given the way the commercial market has gone recently in recent years, I think if we can open that up to more uses and encourage more uses, that's a good step.
And that's an area where it would be compatible, less more so than the industrial area, I think.
I don't know if this is what you're asking for specifically, but yes to design standards. And yes to street trees, yes to wider sidewalks. Yes, 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 yes to all those things.
Especially at the Everett Mall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ditto.
Yes.
Ditto.
Oh, yeah.
And yes to wherever we can squeeze housing in where it's appropriate. Yes to that too. So I don't know if that's what you're asking us for, but that was my opinion.
Just a quick question of curiosity. What's the current height limit in the Everett Mall area? I mean, if it's
Approximately, yeah,
Oh,
somewhere,
short.
it varies. There's two different zones out there, and I think one of them allows greater height than the other, but 50 feet is something that sticks in my mind.
Roger that, thank you.
Although, our code is kind of nuanced in where if you're further away from, say, a single-family zone, you can go taller with a mixed-use building. So if you had that housing component in a mixed-use building, you could probably go up to 80 feet. So those are some things that we need to clean up. We've got so many different standards like that where the height varies based on proximity to other uses. And David's working on something that might simplify that.
If
And
the
that'll be a
application is
future
filed on
meeting.
a Tuesday, you get 3 extra stories, and only if you have blue paint, and then.
Between 4 and 4:15. When the counter is closed.
Any other questions? Going once?
I'm tempted.
Going twice? We are adjourned.
I was saying I have a question.
Oh.
This is kind of reverting to the first item that we did, and I'm just thought it would be good to clarify that question about recusal. If we're in an advisory capacity and someone's not working on a specific project that we're reviewing, is there any need for recusal?
There is not on something that is not specific to a piece of property. If it's citywide, area-wide, no, it's not a quasi-judicial matter. Then the two things that we have to remind commissioners and councils about are conflicts of interest and ex parte contact outside of a public meeting space like this. And so these are legislative items that we're talking about with the supportive housing. The quasi-judicial part of that will come in with the comprehensive plan amendment rezone application on the Norton Ballfield site that has been filed, but that was not, that's why I tried to steer people away from that tonight.
Right, but even with that, if there's no one here working on that specific project, then they don't have to recuse themselves, correct?
Or they have no property interest.
There may be just the appearance of fairness that is something that we also, our attorney does like to remind us that even if somebody is totally fair in their dealing with a proposed application, just the appearance of impropriety may be enough for that person to disqualify themselves from participation.
I think that was, I would just wanted to clarify it and get it out in the open since we're all here. And I think that was a yes, but, that was the way I understood it. Appearance of fairness would apply if they're working on that specific, or somehow concerned with a specific property, correct?
Yes, or even if your next door neighbor was the applicant, developing a property somewhere else in the city, but because you're friends with somebody, there's this appearance of fairness, conflict of interest, those types of things on a quasi-judicial application need to be considered.
Okay, and then we're advisory, we're not making a decision, correct?
Correct, but you still are bound by the
Okay,
same regulations. And
it doesn't even apply to me, except for they're all my neighbors, but I don't agree with them, so I don't. Should I have said that?
Perception is what kills a lot of things.
Actually, though, the comments were pretty evenly divided between supporting the ordinance and not supporting anything about what we were doing, so, just for the record, I kept count.
Okay, we are adjourned.
A minute to spare.